Today is the first video in a series I would like to present on genetics. Specifically, chicken genetics, however all of the terms are used in the same way across all species and areas of genetics. Over the course of the next 5 videos or more, I would like to give a simple overview of a good handful of common terms used in the chicken genetic world that some might find confusing. Since I don't want to lose you from the start, let me first begin by explaining what I mean by the term genetics. Genetics is a branch of biology that deals with hereditary traits and inheritance. For example, your eye color, which comes from your parents, a dog's coat color, which comes from its parents, or a chicken's leg color, which comes from its parents, all have to do with genetics. When you hear the word gene, most people immediately think of DNA, and this is correct. A gene is a strand of DNA, usually located on a chromosome, that determines your physical characteristics such as hair color, eye color, blood type, etc. For chickens, this would involve the color of their feathers, egg color, eye color, leg color, skin color, and even comb type, comb color, earlobe color, the type of feathers they have, and more. Just like it does in humans and other species, genetics also involves body shape, which in chickens includes things like tail angle, wing placement or carriage, type of comb, length of back, and so much more. As I said before, a gene is a strand of DNA located on a chromosome. We humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 total. Chickens actually have 39 pairs of chromosomes, which makes 78 total. Each chromosome contains multiple genes, which live on different parts of the chromosome. You will often hear the word locus in genetics, which is just referring to a gene's location on a chromosome. Before we go on, I would like to first note the difference between nature and nurture. Basically, nature is what you inherit, and nurture is the way you are affected by the environment around you. For example, let's say you have a hen with a single comb. She has 5 points on her comb, but by nurture, or really lack of nurture, she loses one of the points on her comb. Her genes did not change. I won't get into the genetics of comb points because it is much more complicated than this, but let's just say for simplicity's sake that breeding 2 birds with 5 comb points together will always result in offspring with 5 comb points. Breeding this hen that now has 4 comb points to a rooster with 5 comb points will still result in offspring with 5 comb points. Just because she lost a comb point doesn't mean her genes changed. Her genes stayed the same, but because of the environment around her, she lost a comb point. She always will still continue to produce offspring with 5 comb points, even if she loses all her comb points. The environment around your birds does not change their genetics. They might look different due to an accident or even a different type of feed, but their genetics stay the same regardless. Now that we are all on the same page about genes, the definition of genetics, and nature versus nurture, let's look at our first 2 terms, dominant and recessive. And in the next video, I will be explaining incomplete dominance and codominance. The first term or type of gene we are going to be learning about are dominant genes. When chickens breed, the male and female each give 1 copy of each gene for every trait, like feather color, eye color, comb type, etc., to their offspring. You see, every trait has 2 genes. Now, of course, some traits like crests or dwarfism, and varieties like millefleur, porcelain, or patterns like lacing or spangled are a little more complex and involve more genes, but for now, I'll just be focusing on simpler ones that only involve 2 genes. Sometimes these 2 genes are the same gene, which is called homozygous, and sometimes they are 2 different genes, which is called heterozygous. Now, the chick will get 1 gene from the hen and 1 from the rooster. Each of these 2 genes is competing to become the dominant or winning gene within the chick. The winning gene is the one that is expressed, or in other words, the winning gene is the one that you will see. But it's not a fair fight because some genes are always dominant over others. It's not random. For instance, the black gene is always dominant over the lavender gene. Now, it does not matter whether the black gene belongs to the hen or the rooster, because regardless of where the dominant gene, or in this case the black gene, came from, the black gene will always overrule the lavender gene. Now, some genes are sex-linked, which means that it does matter if the male or female is carrying it, but I'm going to leave that for another video. Now, dominance does not just include the subjects of feathers and their color. There's also dominance in terms of combs or even eye color. For instance, a rose comb is always dominant over a single comb, and red eye color is always dominant over dark eye color. The main idea is that some genes are always dominant over other genes, or in other words, certain genes will always win the battle over expression amongst other genes. And this brings us to our second term, recessive genes. Now, recessive genes are the counterpoint or losing genes to the dominant genes. In our last example, I mentioned that black is the dominant gene, which means that lavender is the recessive gene. A recessive gene will never be fully expressed when a gene dominant to it is present. I mentioned earlier that every trait for the most part has two genes, one from the hen and one from the rooster. In a dominant gene, only one copy of that gene needs to be present for it to express or to be visible. For a recessive gene to be visible, two copies must be present. In other words, if two birds were both lavender in color, meaning they both carried two lavender genes each, and you bred them, they would always produce lavender offspring. Since black is dominant to lavender, if you bred a black bird with two black genes to a lavender bird, you would only get black chicks. These black chicks that you got would be called black splits to lavender. They don't look lavender, they look pure black, but they all carry one recessive lavender gene. In other words, they're heterozygous. Now, if you take those adorable little black chicks that all carry one recessive lavender gene and one dominant black gene, and bred them back to the lavender bird, you would get 50% black split to lavender chicks and 50% lavender chicks. Even though you bred a bird that looks black to a lavender bird, because that black bird carried one black gene and one lavender gene, and of course the lavender bird carried two lavender genes, otherwise it wouldn't be lavender, about 50% of the time, the black chicken that carried the lavender gene would give that lavender gene to its offspring, meaning when paired with the lavender chicken, which can only give lavender, the offspring were lavender. Another example of recessive genes would be that single combs are always recessive to rose combs. So, a chick whose parents both have a single comb would always have a chick with a single comb. Or, if two parents had the same recessive eye color, let's say they were dark eyes, the chick would automatically have dark eyes because there is no dominant gene among the two parents to overrule the recessive dark-eyed gene. As a breeder, recessive genes make it easier to get the character traits that you want to create in your flock. Yes, if you were trying to introduce a recessive trait into your existing flock that you know is homozygous dominant for the trait you are trying to change, it is going to take 2 generations before you can see that recessive trait in your line. However, if you already have a recessive trait in your line and want to focus on another trait without losing the existing recessive trait, by buying a bird that already has that existing recessive trait, you know for sure that you will not lose that recessive trait you are trying to keep. For example, mottling is recessive. If you have mottled hens and buy a mottled rooster, or vice versa, all of the offspring will definitely be mottled, so you don't have to worry about losing the mottling. So, if you want a lavender chick with a single comb and dark eyes, even though all these traits are recessive, you can make your Frankenstein bird most definitely have these traits by breeding a rooster and a hen who have all these exact traits. There will be no guesswork to what kind of bird you will get. On the other hand, let's say you want a bird with a rose comb. Now remember, a rose comb is dominant. Let's say you go ahead and purchase a hen and a rooster that both have a rose comb. You breed these birds together, yet somehow you get some offspring with a single comb and some offspring with a rose comb. Well, what just happened? If this is the case, that means that both of the parents were carrying a recessive single comb gene. Because rose combs are dominant, both birds appear to have a rose comb. Yet, without breeding those two birds together to test it, you have no idea whether these birds each have 2 copies of the dominant rose comb gene, or 1 copy of the rose comb gene, and 1 copy of the single comb gene. When you are working for a trait that is dominant, always test breed to a bird that you know is heterozygous or carries a dominant and recessive trait to find out whether or not your new bird is homozygous or heterozygous for that trait. And always remember when test breeding to hatch out as many chicks as you can for the most accurate results. Now, don't get confused like I was when I first got into genetics and thought that some genes were dominant over all other genes and some of genes were always recessive to all of those dominant genes, and I just didn't know what happened when 2 dominant genes were together. For example, black is always dominant to lavender, but dominant white is always dominant over black. It's like a hierarchy. When talking about dominant and recessive genes, There will always be one dominant trait, never two different ones. Well, sort of. Which brings us into our next two terms in the next video, incomplete dominance and codominance.